On a high hill in Kentucky, overlooking the city of Louisville, stands a massive Gothic fortress, a place hiding one of the darkest chapters in American medical history, a colossal structure built in the 1920s. Once the largest and most famous hospital in the entire United States. But this wasn't a normal hospital, but it was a self-contained city. A full kitchen, a post office, a theater, gardens, and recreation rooms, all designed to support thousands of patients, doctors, and nurses who lived here for years, completely isolated from the outside world. And inside those walls, every floor holds stories, experiments, tragedies, and chilling secrets. A place that was once considered a lifeline, slowly transformed into one of the most haunted locations on Earth. Welcome back! Today, I'm going to tell you the story of the haunted Waverly Hills Hospital. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. And I want you to help this video reach 100 likes before the next episode drops. Our story begins in 1883 with Thomas H. Hayes, a former officer and inspector in the Confederate Army. He had spent his entire life serving in the U.S. military until he finally reached retirement. At that moment, he decided it was time to treat himself a little to make up for all the exhaustion and hardship he had lived through. He wanted to escape the noise, the chaos, and the crowded life of the city. He dreamed of finding a quiet, isolated place where he could build a home for himself and his family. He spent months searching until he finally discovered a piece of land in a remote area of Kentucky near the city of Louisville. A wide, open plot of land sitting on a high ridge. Far from the city's noise overlooking the beautiful Ohio River, a breathtaking view and peaceful nature. Exactly what he wanted. Without hesitation, he bought the land and began building the house he had always dreamed of. His family moved into their new home before a serious problem appeared. One he never expected. The house was extremely far from most public services, and Thomas had young daughters who were still in school. The distance made it almost impossible for them to attend classes regularly, and their education began to suffer. Thomas suddenly found himself torn between two painful choices. Either sacrifice the peaceful life he had dreamed of for years and move back to the city, or sacrifice the future of his own daughters. After a long period of thinking, he finally came up with an unexpected solution. He would make use of the wide land he had purchased and build his daughters a small school. It was just a single-room schoolhouse, but it was more than enough for the girls, and for a few children of the scattered neighbors who lived nearby. After searching for a qualified teacher, they finally chose Mrs. Lizzie Lee Harris. Miss Harris was an excellent teacher who loved classical literature, especially the works of the Scottish poet and novelist Sir Walter Scott, particularly his famous novel Waverly. Because of her deep attachment to that novel, the moment she began her job in the small school, she decided to name it Waverly School. When she told Thomas the name, he liked it so much that he decided to give the entire property the same name, Waverly Hill or Waverly Hills, so that the place would be known by that name for generations to come. Even though the school was small and simple, it became a historic start for the entire area. It was the first public-use building ever constructed on that lonely ridge. The place that had once been completely abandoned slowly began to come to life. Parents and children started coming and going, and little by little, the area became known to the people around it. The years passed. Thomas's daughters grew up, finished their education, and eventually graduated. And even though the original purpose of the school was over, Waverly School kept its doors open to the rest of the local children. But as the 20th century began, everything in America, especially in Louisville, changed completely. Tuberculosis, known back then as the White Plague, spread rapidly through the population. Worst of all, the symptoms didn't appear until it was already too late, meaning infected. People had already passed the disease to others before anyone realized. That's exactly what devastated the people of Louisville. The peaceful, beautiful city suddenly became one of the highest infection cities in all of America. At one point, 1 out of every 5 residents was infected with tuberculosis. At the time, medicine had no real cure for the disease. Anyone who caught it faced either a painful death or a lifetime of suffering. Doctors knew they were in the middle of a catastrophe. Tuberculosis was historically known to be extremely contagious, so they understood that patients had to be isolated completely or the city would lose control entirely. But there was a major problem. There were no specialized hospitals for tuberculosis anywhere in the region. And they absolutely couldn't place infected patients in regular hospitals because tuberculosis was airborne. Doing that would have guaranteed the death of countless other patients whose immune systems were already weakened. Because of that, anyone who showed early signs of infection was advised to stay home and treat themselves there. But that only made things worse. The bacteria spread faster, became stronger, and by 1907, the Louisville Hospital Board realized the crisis was out of control. The city desperately needed a dedicated facility for tuberculosis, somewhere far from the population, yet still in a healthy environment. One of the officials had heard about the small school on the ridge overlooking the Ohio River. He suggested that the hill could be the perfect solution. The board agreed and decided to purchase the land from Thomas. And the moment Thomas learned the property would be used for public good, he agreed without hesitation. Just 3 years later, in 1910, Waverly Hills Hospital opened its doors to treat tuberculosis patients. At first, the hospital was just a small 2-wing building. Each wing had only 20 beds for early-stage patients. Despite how simple it was, the facility managed to meet the urgent needs of the time. A major part of the design was the inclusion of large open-air porches and balconies to allow patients to breathe fresh air, because back then, doctors believed clean air and sunlight were the best treatment for tuberculosis. But it didn't take long before the hospital was overwhelmed. As soon as people heard about a specialized TB facility, every newly infected patient rushed there for help. Within just 2 years, the building was filled to maximum capacity. So in 1912, the medical board approved funding for additional units. They built several simple wooden structures, each holding 20 more beds. At the same time, they constructed a separate children's ward to isolate young patients from adult cases and provide specialized care. After the expansion, the hospital's total capacity rose to about 140 patients. But even that wasn't enough. The disease kept spreading and the number of patients kept growing. The problem wasn't just beds. The entire facility was outdated and lacked proper equipment. Doctors needed a much larger, more advanced center where they could treat and isolate patients safely. They kept sending requests for expansion after expansion until 1926, when the government finally realized the old hospital could no longer handle the overwhelming numbers or the rising death toll. That year, the city approved the construction of a brand new Waverly Hills, a massive, state-of-the-art hospital. This new building was nothing like the old one. It covered nearly 100,000 square meters, stood 5 stories tall, and each floor was dedicated to a different category of patients. The number of rooms reached nearly 100, and because treatment for tuberculosis took years, the hospital was designed to function like a self-contained world. They built a library, a theater, a small school for the children, a gym, and a large kitchen staffed by professional chefs. Everything needed to give patients a life that felt as normal as possible, far away from the depressing atmosphere of typical hospitals. Finally, in 1926, the new Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened its doors, capable of housing more than 500 patients. It became the largest and most advanced tuberculosis hospital in the eastern United States. But despite the bright image the public had of cheerful patients living a better life inside the hospital than outside, what happened inside Waverly Hills was nothing like what people imagined. The truth is, doctors at the time had no idea how to treat tuberculosis. They relied on extremely primitive, sometimes brutal methods. Because the main treatment was believed to be rest, fresh air, and good nutrition, patients were forced to lie in bed for endless hours without moving. Doctors thought even the slightest physical effort could strain the lungs. They would even wheel patients' beds and all out onto the open balconies and leave them there for hours under the sun, even in the middle of winter when temperatures dropped below freezing. They believed cold air and sunlight could kill the bacteria, but patients whose lungs were already failing struggled to breathe in the freezing air, and many of them began to die. The real horror began when a patient's condition worsened. Doctors would resort to aggressive treatments, some of the most terrifying procedures ever performed in medical history. One of those procedures was removing the patient's ribs. Doctors believed the ribs and chest muscles were compressing the lungs, preventing them from expanding. Their solution? Remove the ribs entirely and let the lungs breathe freely. These operations were extremely dangerous. Out of every 5 patients who underwent the procedure, 1 died on the operating table. And that's the most optimistic estimate. And the madness didn't stop there. Another treatment used on patients showing severe decline involved inserting a small balloon into the lungs and inflating it to stretch the lung cavity. In theory, this would help the lungs take in more oxygen. In reality, almost nobody survived this operation. Those who did were left with lifelong complications, if they survived at all. Even worse, when tuberculosis began affecting a patient's brain, causing hallucinations or delirium, doctors treated it with electroshock therapy. why electricity? They believed the electric current could kill the virus inside the brain. On top of all that, patients were given massive amounts of medication. So many pills and mixtures that some of them died from drug toxicity, not from tuberculosis itself. Deaths became a daily routine inside Waverly Hills. At certain points, a patient died every single hour. With the rising death toll, doctors needed a way to remove bodies without letting other patients see them, because they feared the constant sight of death would destroy whatever hope the remaining patients had. That's when they came up with the idea of the death tunnel. Inside Waverly Hills, there was a long underground passage about 150 meters connecting the hospital to the railroad tracks at the bottom of the hill. At first, the tunnel was built simply to transport construction materials during the building of the hospital. But soon, some doctors realized it could serve another purpose: removing bodies without letting other patients see the constant stream of death. So whenever a patient died, staff quietly wheeled the body out of the ward, placed it onto a special cart inside the tunnel, and sent it down the rails to the bottom of the hill. At the end of the tunnel, a small morgue was built, where bodies were transferred to the hearses that carried them to the cemetery. The workers at Waverly Hills hated that tunnel with a passion. It was cold, dark, depressing, and every step inside it reminded them of the thousands who had died there. Some estimates say more than 10,000 bodies passed through the tunnel. But the suffering at Waverly Hills wasn't limited to the patients. Working inside a hospital overwhelmed by a deadly, untreatable disease was incredibly dangerous. Nurses and doctors constantly dealt with infected patients face to face, and there were no protective measures like the ones we have today. Many staff members caught the disease themselves and suffered the same fate as the patients they were trying to save. And as if the pressure and fear weren't enough, strange incidents began happening just 2 years after the hospital opened, especially in room 502. One day in 1928, a nurse entered room 502 to grab something from the closet, only to find her colleague, Mary Hillenberg, hanging inside the room. Mary was in her early 20s, unmarried, and spent most of her time working at the hospital. Although she was described as cheerful and playful, co-workers said she hadn't been acting like herself in the weeks leading up to her death. Several theories emerged about why she might have taken her own life, but none of them were ever confirmed. Then, 4 years later in 1932, another nurse, 29 years old, died on the same floor. This time, she fell from the balcony next to room 502. No one knows whether she jumped or was pushed. The discovery of real antibiotics, especially streptomycin, changed everything. Tuberculosis went from being a death sentence to a treatable condition, and the number of patients at Waverly Hills began to drop. Little by little, the massive hospital that was once filled beyond capacity started to empty out. In June of 1961, after 51 years of pain and suffering, Waverly Hills closed its doors as a tuberculosis hospital. But despite the closure, the building reopened the very next year in October 1962 as a facility for elderly patients. The hospital was renamed Woodhaven Geriatric Center. Unfortunately, anyone who talked about Woodhaven had nothing good to say. The facility was understaffed, underfunded, and lacked the nurses needed to care for the residents. Reports soon surfaced of severe neglect. Patients locked in rooms for long hours with no supervision, others tied to their beds for behavior control, and some even subjected to electroshock simply to keep them quiet or make them sleep. All of this was on top of poor sanitation, bad food, and improper medical care. By 1982, authorities had seen enough. Woodhaven was shut down permanently. After its closure, many attempts were made to repurpose the enormous structure, but every project failed, leading locals to say the building was cursed. In 1983, the first major chapter began when a businessman named Jake Leifert Todd bought the land for $300,000 and decided to turn the building into a small prison that could hold around 500 inmates. But the local residents immediately rejected the idea. They protested, pushed back hard, and pressured the government until the request was officially denied. Then, in 1986, Dr. Charles Cipher purchased the section containing the main building for $128,000. He believed it could be a long-term investment, but the years passed and he never gained anything from it. The place slowly deteriorated. 10 more years went by, and in 1996, a new owner stepped in, Robert Albert Husky, and he had a bizarre idea. He wanted to build a massive 47-meter-tall statue of Christ inside the building, taller than the one in Rio de Janeiro. His plan was to transform the place into a religious center. He estimated the full project costed around $10 million. But he didn't have the money to make something that huge happen. So he opened a public donation campaign, hoping people would help fund it. In the end, all he managed to gather was about $3,000. The project failed completely. Over these long years, the massive structure that once operated as a clean, organized hospital turned into a ruin. Moisture ate through the walls, windows shattered, doors were ripped off, and rain poured straight into the heart of the building, through gaps in the ceilings. Thieves took advantage of the abandonment and stripped the place of everything they could get their hands on, even the water pipes. Little by little, the building became a shelter for the homeless and for teenagers looking for an isolated spot to hang out. But the strange thing is that none of them ever stayed inside for more than 2 days. They all insisted they kept hearing the sounds of people screaming in agony from deep inside the building. Even the residents living near the property said they heard the same thing. Voices, or rooms lighting up and switching off in a place where electricity shouldn't even be working anymore. One day, a homeless man entered the building, trying to escape the cold winter night. The next morning, he and his dog were found dead at the bottom of the elevator shaft. Some said he slipped, nothing more than an accident. Others claimed he was pushed, and some swore they heard him screaming. But, of course, there was no evidence. The condition of the building and all the strange incidents happening inside made people in the area terrified of it. One of the locals finally submitted a request to the government, asking them to demolish the structure. But the request was rejected because the building had been officially registered as a historic site. So what did he do? He decided to dig a water trench beneath the building to weaken its foundations, hoping it would collapse on its own. He even hired people to go inside and smash windows and doors to accelerate the decay. But what happened to the people who entered made them regret the moment they agreed to step inside. Terrifying screams, shadowy figures running between the rooms, and breaths chasing them from every direction enough to make them flee the building without finishing what they were hired to do. The situation stayed the same, but what happened marked the beginning of the ghost stories that started spreading about the place. Groups interested in dark arts and the supernatural began visiting the building regularly, and some even performed rituals resembling satanic practices, especially in the infamous Room 502. Then in 2001, 2 people named Charlie and Tina bought the property for $225,000, hoping to restore the building to its former glory. At the time, they had no idea about the strange rumors the locals told. All they knew was that the building had once been a great tuberculosis hospital. They spent the first 2 years cleaning the place and even brought in the Air Pollution Control Board to run tests. The results confirmed the building was clean and safe to use. Tina, excited about the progress, decided to film the building with a video camera to document its condition. But when she reviewed the footage, she found strange images. A figure standing at the end of the hallway, a floating orb in midair, and shadows moving between the rooms, even though she had been completely alone that day. Only days later, Fox News contacted them for an interview. During the conversation, they asked about the supernatural claims people talked about. Tina told them there was a video they needed to see. After they watched the footage, the crew came to film the building themselves. From that moment, Waverly Hills became known across the entire United States as a haunted place. Charlie and Tina decided to make use of the sudden fame. In 2003, they started offering guided tours inside the building, and visitors from all over the world began arriving. Many confirmed that the place was genuinely haunted, and that the strange phenomena people talked about happened frequently. The most famous spirit was that of a young boy named Timmy, who is said to have died in the hospital and whose ghost never left. Timmy rarely appeared himself, but the ball he used to play with was often seen bouncing through the hallways before disappearing. The story became so well known that visitors started bringing him balls as gifts, leaving them behind on the floors of the 3rd level, where Timmy was often seen. On that same floor, another ghost reportedly appeared. A little girl named Mary, wearing a dress and short hair, seen wandering between the rooms. One visitor even claimed he spoke to her, and she told him she hated it when strangers came into the building. Many others insisted they saw the spirit of a man dressed as a chef, walking out of what used to be the hospital kitchen. And near room 502, people reported seeing a woman drenched in blood, running before vanishing completely, believed to be the ghost of the nurse who died in that very room. And then there were the screams clear, echoing cries rising from the body chute beneath the building. All of these stories only added to the building's fame, turning it into a magnet for anyone who believed in the world of ghosts and the supernatural. And with that, we reach the end of today's story. Tell me your thoughts. And if there's another tale you want me to cover, drop it in the comments. The idea with the most engagement wins. Now show your support, like, comment, subscribe, and share the video with someone you think would enjoy it. See you next time with a story even more thrilling than this one. Goodbye.